So now Dr. House, he has an idea of why the economy isn't great, but now he has to figure out, well, how do you treat it? And for that, he's going to call in another doctor, and he wants a specialist. He's going to call in someone that knows how to make things great again. And that is Dr. Trump. Now, I know he's not a doctor, but it's not because he doesn't have the intellect to be a doctor. He has tremendous intellect, probably more than any US president we've seen. The problem with Dr. Trump, and I'm going to use another doctor analogy, is sort of like Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. You don't know if you're going to get this guy, Dr. Trump, or he's going to turn into this guy, Mr. Burns. Case in point, the election was November 8th. When all of you woke up the next morning, November 9th, you turned on the TV, you looked at the newspaper, you saw the headlines. This is what you thought. WTF. Will Trump fail or flourish? Because there is a risk-return element that we're dealing with Donald Trump. And we borrowed this idea from Business Insider. We thought we'd map that out, show the risk-return versus the probability of a Trump presidency. So let's look at the most negative result, but lowest probability would be nuclear war, end of mankind. Doesn't get any worse than that. As we go up the risk curve, we can see trade war with China, obviously a bad result. Trump impeached due to Russian collusion. Now, some people would put that on the positive side of the ledger. I would maintain anytime you have a weak US president, that's bad for US growth and bad for the economy. And it's bad for me doing this presentation because I have to redo the whole thing. Most probable, bringing embarrassment to America on the world stage, well, that ship has sailed, quite frankly. Let's look at the positive side. Good trade deals. He's a good deal maker. You could get some good deals, some cool infrastructure stuff, maybe a hyperloop. That would be nice. And maybe even you get a wall and Mexico paying for it. The whole point of showing this is we recognize there is a risk return on this, and we recognize the anxiety that a Trump presidency brings, and also that this could all go very terribly wrong. So our marketing department made us put up a disclaimer, and they're going to make me read it if I can read it. This presentation is not an endorsement of President Trump or an endorsement of any President Trump's policies. Nicola Wealth Management has had no contact with any Russian foreign nationals in the past, nor do we intend to in the future. Anything to the negative or to the contrary is fake news. So now, let's look at what Dr. Trump is talking about. It's I'm going to call it 5 different pillars. It's deregulation, corporate tax reform, infrastructure spending, trade, and immigration. The first one, deregulation, this is showing a chart asking small business what they feel the biggest problems they face are. Small business is important in the US because 80% of new jobs come from small business. And you can see regulation is cited as one of the most important problems they face. Case in point, George Mason University points out that regulations across 22 industries reduces GDP by 80 basis points a year. If there were no new regulations since 1980, they think the economy would be 25% greater than it is. The World Bank, they put out a report every year. It's called the Ease of Doing Business. For starting a new business, the US ranks 51 out of 190 countries. Case in point, in 2012, it took 40 days to get a construction permit. Last year, it was double that amount. In 1950, 5% of workers required a license or certificate to do their job in the US. Last year, it was 30%. Anything Donald Trump is able to do to help the economy work more efficiently and increase productivity is good for economic growth. And it's one of the reasons why all our doctors would agree that doing and changing this would help make the economy great again. Next up is corporate tax reform. You can see the brown line is US tax rates. They haven't changed in about 20 years, stuck at about 38 to 40% depending on the state. Whereas the OECD average, you can see that blue line moving lower. So tax rates in foreign countries are lower. It puts US companies at a competitive disadvantage. The brown bars are showing inversions. What those are, it's US companies buying foreign companies to take advantage of their lower tax rate. It takes tax revenue away from the United States. It takes manufacturing outside of the United States. Trump wants to lower taxes. We don't know how much, and we don't know the program yet. He hasn't announced it. Anything he does to lower taxes is going to serve to increase corporate profits and increase economic growth. The other thing he's going to do, likely, that we haven't seen in the program, is there's about $2 trillion that US companies hold offshore. It's likely he will include some kind of amnesty package that will enable companies to bring that money back to the US so it can be put back into the US economy. Both of these things would be good for the US economy. The one negative with this is if you reduce the tax rate and you have no revenue offsets, it's going to increase the deficit. And you can see from these lines, depending on the plan, you can see how the deficit is projected to get higher. There are a lot of Republicans in the US Congress that are very vigilant on higher debt levels. So it's not guaranteed that he will get everything he wants. And it's one of the reasons why, from a deleveraging point of view, our deleveraging doctors would say this is not a good idea, whereas the other doctors would say, yes, this will help treat the economy. Next up is infrastructure spending. It's much the same story. You can see from this graph, the infrastructure in the US is old and needs to be replaced. A case in point, the average US commuter spends about 40 hours a year wasted waiting in traffic. So anything Trump can do to help make the efficiency of the transportation system better is going to increase productivity. It also could have a multiplier effect on the economy. He wants to spend about $1 trillion over 10 years. Moody Analytics estimates that the multiplier effect on that would be about 1.2 times that. This is the fiscal policy that Dr. Summers is talking about. You spend money on the economy, and you make up for the demand that all of you are not putting in by buying and spending more. Again, the problem with this is the costs and what that's going to do to the debt. A group of civil engineers estimates that it's not $1 trillion it's going to cost to bring the US infrastructure up to a safe and functioning level. It's more like $4.6 trillion. If you added $1 trillion to the US debt, you would increase it by about 5%. If you increase it by $4.6 trillion, it's about 25%. Again, our deleveraging doctors wouldn't like this. The other doctors would find this a good idea. Trade is the next one, and it gets a little tougher. This chart, it's called the elephant chart. And what it does is it takes real income gains by percentage from 1988 to 2008, so just before the Great Recession. And it groups them, the wage gains, by percentile globally. So you can see here the top 1%, so from the 95th to 100th percentile, the proverbial 1%, you can see the blue lines there, they did okay. You can see wage growth was actually not too bad. The people in the 60th percentile also did pretty well. That's the Asian middle class, particularly in China. Who did really poorly is around the 80th to the 95th percentile. That's predominantly the US and Western lower middle class. And this is one of the reasons, this chart is one of the reasons why Trump won the election and Hillary Clinton lost, because he recognized this. A lot of this is based off of trade imbalances and what Mervyn King was talking about. Now, why is this called the elephant graph? Because it's shaped like an elephant. And this took me a lot of time, but I want to point out, it shows you that you can be a financial analyst and also be artistic. Trump believes that the US has a bad deal when it comes to trade, and we think he has a point. If you look, the US last year had a trade deficit of about $500 billion. But it's not just tariffs where the US has some disadvantages. It's with a value-added tax. The US is the only country in the OECD that does not have a value-added tax. This is where they're at a disadvantage. Let's assume a US company is exporting to Mexico. As soon as that good hits the Mexican border, it is assessed a 20% duty. If a Mexican company exports to the US, as soon as that good leaves Mexico, they get a 20% tax credit. So you can see US manufacturers are at a disadvantage under this system. See how this works? China is about 70% of that $500 billion trade deficit. If you take the average tariff in China and you add the VAT tax, you get a total of about 27% versus 9% in the US. So US manufacturers have a hard time competing against a Chinese competitor. In Japan, who also have a very high trade deficit or trade surplus, it's about 70 billion. You can see the total tariff and VAT tax is only 12% versus 9%. Japan is likely not going to be as big a target for the US. Germany, however, will be. Their trade surplus, $65 billion. You add their VAT tax and their average tariff, it's 24% versus 9% in the US. And unfortunately for poor Mexico, at $63 billion surplus, their total is 23%. So it's likely Trump, is there room for some trade deals? Yeah, we think there is. We don't know what he's going to do. The big risk is obviously if you start some kind of trade war. But we think there is room for negotiation. One of the things you could look at would be, and John's going to mention this as well, a border adjustment tax. Maybe the US needs a VAT tax, but I think something needs to be done to address this discrepancy. But if you do this, it's not going to solve the problem you have for the lower middle class that we saw in the elephant graph. And the reason is, any new manufacturing you're going to put in the US, it's not going to be like the manufacturing you lost. You're not going to help the steel workers. You're not going to help the coal miners. You're not going to help the garment industry. Those jobs are gone for good. The new jobs are going to be heavily automated and highly skilled. Case in point, Oxford University believes that nearly 50% of US jobs will be automated in the next 20 years. McKinsey & Company points out that 45% of today's activities already can be automated, but this is key. Only 5% can be fully automated. That means the jobs that are going to be created you're going to have to work with technology. You're going to need to have higher skills. Deloitte believes automation could lift productivity 80 to 140 basis points a year over the next 20 or over the next 50 years. Because of this, both from a productivity point of view, our productivity doctor, Dr. Gordon would like this, as well from a savings glut in trade imbalance point of view, Dr. King would also think, again, this would be a good thing and make the economy great again. The last one, immigration, quite frankly, we do not get. If you look at this cartoon, it's showing that GDP growth is actually population growth plus productivity growth. We've already talked about how low productivity growth has been. Population growth is even worse. You look at this chart, you see population growth since World War II has moved lower. Pew Research believes that over the next 20 years, the working population is only going to increase by 30 basis points. Immigration is about 1 million people per year. If you cut that in half, population growth is only going to be 0.1%. If you eliminate all immigration, you're going to have population declines. This doesn't make sense if you want GDP growth and if you want to make the economy great again. It also doesn't make sense to build a wall and get rid of undocumented workers. Pew Research says that there are 8 million undocumented workers. That's 5% of the civilian population in the US. But they're the type of workers you want. Most of them are between the ages of 18 and 64. And in an aging demographic, you want these workers. And the fact is 70% of them work in agriculture and construction. You have a hard time finding people in the US willing to do this work. It doesn't make sense that you would get rid of them. So we don't understand why Trump would be looking at immigration. So one of the issues when we look at all of these different policies, our concern would be that it could shoot some adrenaline in GDP growth for the next year or two. But if you don't address the trade imbalances and if you don't let the economy still de-lever, all you're going to end up in a couple of years is the same slow growth and high debt, which is going to be a worse position. We have some other things that we think need to be looked at. And all of our doctors in immigration think that's a bad thing. First one would be education. And what this is showing, it's from a program for international student assessment, a so-called PISA test. It's given to 15-year-old students to rank how they do relative to their global peers. You can see in mathematics, the US ranked 38 out of 71. Canada actually came in 9th, a respectable 9th. Reading, they did even worse, 39 out of 71. Canada came 3rd. We are good readers. And in science, the US came 24th out of 71. Canada came 7th. So you can see the US is falling behind their global peers and competitors in education. Case in point, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology said the US will need 1 million more STEM professionals, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics over the next decade than they currently produce. They will need to increase their STEM degrees by 34%. If the new jobs are going to require higher skills, you need the workforce that is going to be able to provide that. And so education is very important, and the US is falling behind. That needs to be addressed. Next is healthcare. If you make the point that GDP growth is population plus productivity, you need a healthy population and a productive population. You can see from this chart, the US spends more per capita than any other country, and yet their life expectancy is lower than any developed nation. In fact, last year, the life expectancy in the US declined for the first time since 1993. This needs to be addressed, and it's more than just reforming the Affordable Care Act. We went to a conference last year before the election, and one of the speakers was a political analyst, and he commented at the end of his presentation on two things that neither candidate, Trump or Hillary Clinton, addressed that he felt needed to be addressed. One was the opiate epidemic in the US, and that's one of the reasons why the life expectancy rates are going down. The other thing he talked about is our next slide, which is entitlement spending reform. You can see here that last year, what it costs for Medicare, healthcare, and Social Security versus the tax revenue that was generated versus what it's going to look like in 30 years. You can see that in 30 years, almost all the tax revenue you generate is going to be spent for just these two programs. It's unsustainable. It's going to lead to a higher and higher deficit. Everyone in Washington knows this. You can't wait until the US hits a crisis before this is addressed. It needs to be addressed soon and right away. It will help increase consumer confidence because people will have more confidence that these programs are actually going to be around because they're on an unsustainable path. The last thing we're going to talk about is monetary policy. You can see from these lines, of the last 5 recessions, the US Federal Reserve, actually 4 recessions, sorry, the US Federal Reserve has decreased interest rates on average 5%. Well, if interest rates are at 0, or presently 75 basis points, you don't have room to decrease interest rates. If the US were to go into a recession, and remember, that's what we were concerned about at the beginning of last year, there's nothing the Federal Reserve can do about it. The US Federal Reserve needs to increase interest rates in order to give themselves some policy room to address the issues if the US were to go into recession. But the other thing is, low interest rates, but more to the point, negative interest rates don't work. They give you the opposite effect of what you're looking for. They lower consumer confidence and communicate fear. If you're saying we have to go to negative interest rates to stimulate the economy, I don't think you're going to feel like spending more money. It hurts savers. If interest rates are very low, you have to save more money for retirement. You're going to spend less. It's one of the reasons why demand, according to Dr. Larry Summers, that's why demand was so low. Also increases the wealth gap. It's, the only thing that monetary policy and low interest rates did was increase the value of financial assets. Who has financial assets but the rich? It didn't help the poor. So that, again, helps increase the the wealth gap. The one thing about, and so we think monetary policy needs to be normalized. We think interest rates have to go up. But the one thing about this, if the US is the only country in the world that is increasing interest rates, the result is the US dollar is going to increase. And remember, we said one of the things you need to do is you need to address the global trade imbalances. A high US dollar is going to do the opposite. So what needs to happen is you need other countries to follow. So it can't be just the US increasing interest rates. We think interest rates have to start going up around the world, and including Europe, where they still have negative interest rates.